Today we are taking a look at a very topical issue, the proposal to amend the U-Space regulation to introduce U-Space Airspace Level 1. We look at what U-Space Airspace Level 1 is and what impact it could have on the drone community. Let's get started. In June 2026, EASA announced that as part of its activities to simplify drone regulation, it also wanted to introduce changes to the U-Space regulation in a kind of light version, the so-called U-Space Airspace Level 1. Shortly afterwards, in July, a proposal for an amendment was published and feedback was requested from stakeholders. The reactions were rather mixed. Today, we take a closer look at the proposal. What does the proposal contain? What does EASA hope to achieve with this measure? Before we start, a brief note. As already mentioned at the beginning, this is a proposal. This means that at the current point in time, we cannot say whether further changes will be made to the text or whether the amendment will actually be adopted. Accordingly, everything said in this video is based on the current status as of August 2026. In April 2021, the original U-Space regulation was published. It became applicable almost 2 years later in January 2023. The date came and went, months passed, but there was still no U-Space airspace in sight. And even more than 3 years after the regulation became applicable, the member states continued to show a rather cautious approach. We can only speculate about the reasons. Is there still not enough drone traffic to justify establishing a U-Space airspace? Are member states reluctant because they want to avoid the effort involved in setting one up? Or might they have concerns about starting directly in areas with a high degree of complexity, such as major cities? Whatever the reasons may be, we are clearly seeing considerable reluctance so far when it comes to designating U-Space airspaces. And of course, this is also being noticed at EU level. In recent months, EASA had already been working intensively on ways to simplify drone regulations 2019/945 and 947. In this context, the idea arose that this opportunity could also be used to introduce simplifications for U-Space. Within just a few weeks, the proposal for U-Space Light, or U-Space Airspace Level 1, as it is officially called, was developed. Let's take a look at what exactly lies behind U-Space Airspace Level 1. First, let's clarify the terminology. Under the draft legislation, the U-Space framework will in future be divided into 2 levels. U-Space Airspace Level 2 refers to the full version of U-Space, which is also the subject of the existing regulation. EASA's proposal to simplify U-Space is called U-Space Airspace Level 1. This is part of the proposed amendment. U-Space Level 1 can be understood as a subset of Level 2. In other words, it is not a new framework, but simply a reduced form of the existing framework. So how does Level 1 differ from Level 2? First, in U-Space Airspace Level 1, only 2 of the 6 U-Space services will be mandatory. These are the Network Identification Service and the Traffic Information Service. As a reminder, the Network Identification Service receives data from the drone, such as its position, altitude, UAS operator registration number, etc. It is a capability requirement on UAS in U-Space airspaces to be electronically conspicuous. For the Traffic Information Service, the position data of drones and the air traffic data of manned aviation are combined into an air traffic picture and made available to UAS operators. The aim is to ensure that UAS operators are aware of other aircraft with sufficient look-ahead time. For example, displaying aircraft to a UAS operator that are within a 5 minutes range of the operation would give this operator these 5 minutes to identify potential conflicts and take appropriate action. In addition to the Network and Traffic Identification Service, a member state may optionally stipulate that the Geo-awareness service must also be provided and used. In any case, the UAS Flight Authorization Service would no longer be mandatory in U-Space Airspace Level 1. The second important distinction between U-Space Level 1 and Level 2 concerns where U-Space airspace can be established. As a reminder, U-Space in its previous version, that is Level 2, was intended only for certain areas, in particular with an expected large number of simultaneous operations of UAS or areas where UAS operate alongside manned aircraft. In other words, areas where increased traffic density is to be expected. U-space airspace level 1, by contrast, is intended to be established in areas where a relatively low number of aircraft, both manned and unmanned, is expected. In addition, there should be a low ground risk. In other words, if two drones were to collide, the risk to uninvolved third parties on the ground should be low. This means U-space airspace level 1 is intended to be established in areas below the minimum flight altitude of manned aviation, outside airport areas and outside larger cities. That is, in areas with a relatively low level of complexity. What would be different for UAS operators in level 1 airspace? First of all, they would not have to submit any UAS flight authorization requests. Once a UAS operator is ready to start their flight, they would notify the USSP. No waiting for the USSP to grant the UAS flight authorization request. Notify and take off. But the UAS operator must avoid conflict with other aircraft, and this includes other unmanned aircraft, of course. With the removal of the UAS flight authorization service in U-space airspace level 1, USSP would not perform strategic deconfliction between UAS. The responsibility for avoiding conflicts with other unmanned aircraft lies solely with the UAS operator. I have summarized the responsibilities for conflict avoidance in a table. In U-space airspace level 2, USSP performs strategic deconfliction between UAS. This is the task of the UAS flight authorization service. In U-space airspace level 2 inside a control zone, the air traffic control unit and the USSPs are responsible for the segregation of manned and unmanned aircraft. This is implemented by means of dynamic airspace reconfiguration. In U-space airspace level 2, outside of control zones, a UAS operator is responsible for avoiding conflicts with manned aircraft. For this, they rely on the traffic information service. In conclusion, with the removal of the UAS flight authorization in level 1 U-space airspaces, the responsibility for avoiding conflicts with other unmanned aircraft falls to the UAS operator by means of the traffic information service. Incidentally, this is not entirely new, since UAS operators in U-space airspace level 2 are already responsible for avoiding conflicts with unmanned aircraft in cases where some rogue drone operates outside their authorization. While this risk is normally mitigated by USSP strategic deconfliction, the residual risk is not always negligible, and UAS operators remain responsible for avoiding any collision hazard. This is stipulated by Article 11 of the U-space regulation. If primarily UAS operators are responsible for conflict avoidance in U-space airspace level 1, can safety really be ensured? Before answering this question, we should remind ourselves once again of the role U-space actually plays. To do so, let's first take a look at two practical applications. Example 1. A roofer uses a drone to inspect a customer's roof. The drone flies above the house and remains within the roofer's line of sight at all times. By monitoring the airspace around the drone, the roofer ensures that there is no conflict with other aircraft. Under previous rules, that was sufficient. Example 2. A company conducts transport flights. The flights are conducted BVLOS, that is, the remote pilot has no direct line of sight to the UAS. As long as the company's own drone is the only aircraft operating in the airspace, there is no problem at all. But as soon as other aircraft also use the airspace, measures eventually have to be taken to prevent conflicts between the different airspace users. Let's take a look at road traffic to illustrate this. In areas such as villages where relatively few cars pass through, you generally won't find traffic control measures such as pedestrian crossings or traffic lights. But as traffic increases and the safety of pedestrians and cyclists crossing the road still has to be ensured, the local authority would introduce traffic control measures. And why? To ensure safe and fair use of the public road. Safety may be obvious, but why fair use? If pedestrians want to cross a road where one car after another is passing and there is effectively no opportunity to cross the road, a traffic light would ensure that pedestrians or cars from side roads would also get their turn. It is no different in aviation. As air traffic increases, measures have to be taken to maintain safety and fairness. And since an individual airspace user cannot perform this task, the member state takes appropriate measures. In the case of manned aviation, this is done by introducing air traffic management, for which air navigation service providers are responsible. In unmanned aviation, air traffic management is in turn provided by USSPs, partly in cooperation with air navigation service providers. USpace is therefore a measure established by a member state to maintain aviation safety as traffic density increases, while also ensuring fair access to airspace. In USpace Airspace Level 2, increased traffic volumes are expected from the outset, which makes additional traffic management measures necessary. In USpace Airspace Level 1, by contrast, relatively little traffic is expected. This means that the state can ensure airspace safety with fewer measures. It is therefore sufficient to provide UAS operators with the position data of other aircraft so that they can maintain the appropriate separation themselves. And the fact that providing traffic information is sufficient in this case is demonstrated by practice. In Germany, BVLOS operations are already regularly conducted in the form of inspection or transport flights. To mitigate air risk, UAS operators use services that display air traffic to them. The only drawback? These are uncertified services. This means that in general, UAS operators cannot rely on these services to meet a minimum standard of quality. More importantly, they are also dependent on the competent authority recognizing the use of these services as a mitigation measure. Furthermore, outside USpace airspaces, there is no obligation for manned aviation to make itself electronically conspicuous. Outside USpace airspaces, unmanned aircraft are also only effectively electronically conspicuous if, for example, they are equipped with ADS-B or FLAM. There is no guarantee of this, however. Within USpace Airspace Level 1, both UAS and manned aviation would have to make themselves electronically conspicuous. UAS operators could rely on approved traffic information services, which in turn would increase the likelihood of obtaining operational authorizations from the competent authorities. Of the 4 mandatory services, only the Network Identification Service and the Traffic Information Service are to be provided in USpace Airspace Level 1. But why these services in particular? As already mentioned, we need the Network Identification Service to make UAS electronically conspicuous in the airspace. This seems obvious. But why don't we simply use the UAS Flight Authorization Service instead of the Traffic Information Service? Because that simply would not be sufficient. As a reminder, the UAS Flight Authorization Service is responsible for ensuring conflict-free operations between drones. In USpace airspace outside control zones, UAS operators remain responsible for avoiding conflicts with manned aviation. And the prerequisite for this is, in turn, traffic information. In other words, we cannot do without the Traffic Information Service. And yes, this means that investments will have to be made in infrastructure, that is, antennas for collecting position data or mobile communications infrastructure. The Spanish Aviation Safety Authority EASA has calculated this. For EU-wide deployment of ADSL antennas, it estimated investment costs of 84 million euros for minimum coverage and around 130 million euros for the version with increased redundancy. To put this into perspective, between 2021 and 2027, the EU has been investing 25.8 billion euros in funding to support transport infrastructure projects. At 130 million euros, we are therefore talking about 0.4% of this funding volume. In comparison, that really isn't much. USpace Airspace Level 1 is not a fundamentally new concept. Rather, it is a subset of the full USpace version. What does this mean in practice? Let's assume that a member state decides to establish USpace Airspace Level 1 in an area. An airspace risk assessment is carried out, and based on the relatively low traffic volume, it is confirmed that Level 1 is sufficient. USpace Airspace Level 1 is established and well received by users. Over time, increased demand is identified that can no longer be covered by USpace Airspace Level 1. What would have to be done? Under certain circumstances, a new airspace risk assessment might have to be carried out, in particular if the USpace airspace is to be expanded vertically or laterally. For USpace Airspace Level 2, the performance requirements for UAS and USpace services, as well as any operating conditions and airspace restrictions, would have to be established. USSPs that had previously provided their services in the airspace would have to be informed in good time that they would in the future have to provide all 4 U-Space services. If not already available, certification of the additional services would be required. UAS operators would likewise have to be informed that, due to the increased traffic volume, additional measures would be required to maintain airspace safety, and that they would therefore have to use additional services in future. U-Space Airspace Level 1 can therefore certainly be regarded as an entry point into U-Space. However, this does not mean that one would be permanently locked into Level 1. So what would the proposed amendment actually bring us? For one thing, Level 1 could make it easier for member states to enter the world of U-Space. There would be no need to start with establishing U-Space airspaces in complex airspaces. Instead, they could start in simpler areas. This could allow experience to be gained in less complex areas and help build confidence in the system and in drones as a new mode of transport. USSPs would initially only have to offer and be certified for 2 services. Furthermore, USSPs would have the opportunity to expand their services. Although Level 1 airspace would not be expected to have a comparable number of unmanned airspace users as Level 2 airspace, the proposed amendment would mean that U-Space could also be established in areas that may not originally have been the focus. For US operators, it could make it easier to obtain operational authorizations if they could rely on certified services recognized by the authorities. And air traffic would have to make itself electronically conspicuous in areas where U-Space is established, which would increase safety. Is there an alternative to introducing U-Space Airspace Level 1? Of course, there's always the option of doing nothing. In other words, we could simply leave things as they are. But that would also mean that there is a high probability that we would continue to see no or only very few U-Space airspaces for the foreseeable future. My personal opinion on U-Space Airspace Level 1? EASA's proposal is actually quite good. Is it perfect? No. But does such a thing as a perfect solution even exist? Probably not. We currently have this small window of opportunity in which EASA can propose amendments to the existing regulation to the Commission in order to make it easier to enter the U-Space system. Should we miss this opportunity, we would reportedly have to wait a few years until EASA can make the necessary resources available again for this topic. In my opinion, we should definitely take advantage of this opportunity now. So what do you think? Do you consider U-Space Airspace Level 1 an opportunity for our industry? If you would like to support the proposed amendment introducing U-Space Airspace Level 1, contact your industry association. Or write in the comments below and let us know what you think. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye!